It was the kind of morning Sarah had lived 1,000 times. Quiet, predictable, safe. But within hours, that same front porch where she stood sipping coffee would be swarming with police officers, their urgent voices shattering the peace. If only she had noticed the first small signs. The sun had barely risen above the rows of identical rooftops, casting a warm golden glow over the quiet suburban street. Dew still clung to the edges of the neatly mowed lawns, each droplet catching the early light like a tiny jewel. Sarah Thompson stood in her kitchen barefoot, her hair still tousled from sleep, as the smell of freshly brewed coffee drifted through the air. She wasn't in any rush. Wednesdays were slow days. No meetings, no errands, nothing that couldn't wait until tomorrow. From the open window above the sink, she could hear the birds in the oak tree out front. They always seemed to start their morning conversations before she did. A soft breeze carried in the faint scent of her neighbor's freshly cut grass, even though it had been mowed the afternoon before. She poured her coffee into her favorite mug, the one with the tiny chip on the rim, and leaned against the counter. Her routine was like clockwork. Coffee, then a quick check on her potted plants out on the porch. She liked to pretend that keeping them alive was a small victory in her otherwise predictable suburban life. The lavender plant was just starting to bloom again, a sign that spring had finally settled in. She knelt to pinch off a wilted leaf, humming quietly to herself, when the sound of a car engine caught her attention. It wasn't unusual to hear cars on this street, but the slow, steady idling didn't match the normal rhythm of the morning traffic. Sarah straightened, coffee cup in hand, and glanced down the street. Parked 3 houses away was a dark-colored sedan she didn't recognize. The windows were tinted so heavily that she couldn't see inside. She frowned, wondering whose it might be, but quickly brushed the thought aside. People had visitors all the time. A familiar voice pulled her out of her thoughts. "Morning, Sarah." It was Tom Jenkins, her retired neighbor from across the street. He stood by his mailbox, wearing the same faded baseball cap he always did, holding a small stack of letters. His golden retriever, Max, sat obediently at his side. "Morning, Tom," she replied with a smile. "How's Max doing today?" "Same as ever," spoiled. Tom chuckled, giving Max a pat on the head. The dog's tail thumped happily against his leg. "Looks like it's going to be another beautiful day." Sarah nodded. "Sure does." They exchanged a few more pleasantries before Tom headed back inside. Sarah lingered on the porch a moment longer, sipping her coffee. The sedan was still there. She noticed now that it wasn't idling anymore, but its position was odd. It wasn't parked directly in front of any house, just slightly angled toward the curb, as if the driver hadn't decided whether to stay or move on. Still, she told herself it was nothing. This was a safe neighborhood. Nothing ever happened here. Inside, the radio played softly in the background as she moved through her morning routine. The news was the usual mix. Politics, a weather update, some story about a local high school fundraiser. Nothing worth dwelling on. She placed her mug in the sink, tied her hair into a loose ponytail, and opened the fridge to decide what to make for breakfast. A sudden thud from outside made her glance toward the front window. It was probably just the wind knocking over a recycling bin, she thought. But when she looked, she saw a man walking briskly past her driveway. She didn't recognize him. He wore a dark hoodie pulled up over his head, and though the temperature was mild, his hands were stuffed deep into his pockets. He glanced up toward her porch for the briefest second before looking away. Sarah hesitated, her instincts telling her something about him didn't fit. She watched as he turned the corner at the end of the block and disappeared from view. The phone rang, startling her. It was her sister, Jenna, calling from the city. They chatted for a few minutes about weekend plans. Jenna wanted Sarah to come visit for brunch, but Sarah's mind kept drifting back to the sedan and the stranger in the hoodie. She didn't mention it to Jenna. It felt silly to bring up something so small. After the call ended, she stepped out back to water her garden. The air was fresh, the soil dark and rich from the rain 2 nights before. She knelt to pull a few weeds, the quiet broken only by the distant sound of a lawn mower somewhere down the block. By the time she came back inside, the sedan was gone. She felt an odd sense of relief. Telling herself she'd been overthinking it, she switched the radio to music, letting the familiar rhythm fill the house. But then, as she set her coffee mug back on the counter, she noticed something else, a shadow that moved across the edge of her living room window. Not from a passing car or a tree swaying in the breeze, but something closer, deliberate. Her heart skipped a beat. She took a slow step toward the window, peering through the sheer curtains, but saw nothing. Just her yard, the street beyond, and the same peaceful scene she'd woken up to. For now. Sarah stood in the middle of her living room, her eyes fixed on the window where she thought she had seen the shadow. The sheer curtain swayed slightly in the breeze from the half-open window, but beyond that, there was nothing out of place. The street looked calm, the same patch of sunlight still stretching across her driveway, the same quiet hum of suburban life. She shook her head, telling herself it was probably a trick of the light or her imagination playing games. Still, a tiny knot of unease stayed in her stomach. She moved toward the kitchen to pour herself a second cup of coffee, glancing at the clock as she passed. It was only 9:17 a.m. The day was just beginning. She had a book she'd been meaning to read, and a basket of laundry that could wait until later. But her mind kept circling back to the stranger in the hoodie and the sedan that had been parked down the street. As she stood at the counter, the faint hum of an engine caught her attention again. It wasn't loud, more like a low, steady purr, the kind of sound you only notice if the world around you is otherwise still. She turned toward the window and, sure enough, the dark sedan had returned. This time, it was parked even closer, only 1 house away. Her pulse quickened. She tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a friend of the Johnsons next door, or someone waiting to pick someone up. She forced herself to turn away from the window and focus on something else. She switched on the TV for background noise, landing on a morning talk show where the hosts were laughing about a cooking segment gone wrong. The cheerful voices felt out of place in the quiet tension building inside her home. A knock at the front door made her jump. It wasn't loud, just 2 quick taps, but it was enough to send her heart racing. She walked to the door and peeked through the peephole. Relief washed over her when she saw it was Mrs. Carter from 2 houses down. She opened the door with a smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Carter." The older woman's expression was tight, her usual warm demeanor replaced by something more serious. "Sarah," she said, glancing over her shoulder before continuing, "have you noticed that car out there?" Sarah hesitated. "Yes, it's been around since this morning. I thought maybe it was visiting someone." Mrs. Carter shook her head. "I don't think so. It's been circling the block for at least an hour. And that man, the one in the hoodie? I saw him earlier, too. He was standing near the corner, just watching." A shiver ran down Sarah's spine. "Did you call anyone?" "No, not yet. I wasn't sure if it was anything worth bothering the police about," Mrs. Carter admitted. "But it doesn't feel right." They spoke for a few more minutes, their eyes flicking toward the street every few seconds. Finally, Mrs. Carter excused herself, saying she had to get back to her baking. Sarah closed the door and locked it, something she rarely did during the day. For the next hour, she tried to go about her morning as normal. She folded laundry, answered a couple of emails, and even made herself a sandwich. But every time she passed by a window, she caught sight of that car, or thought she did. Sometimes it was further down the block, sometimes gone altogether, only to reappear a little while later. By early afternoon, Sarah decided some fresh air might clear her head. She grabbed her gardening gloves and headed to the front yard to trim the hedges. The sun was warmer now, the breeze softer, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. As she bent to snip a low branch, movement caught her eye. Across the street, near the corner, the man in the hoodie was back. This time, he wasn't moving. He stood completely still, his hands still buried in his pockets, his head tilted slightly as if he was looking in her direction. Sarah's grip on the clippers tightened. She told herself not to stare, but her eyes kept darting back toward him. After a few seconds, he turned and slowly began to walk away, disappearing once again around the corner. That was when Tom Jenkins reappeared, strolling out to his driveway with Max at his side. She called out to him, trying to sound casual. "Hey, Tom, do you know who that guy is?" "The one in the hoodie?" Tom looked puzzled. "What guy?" "He was just at the corner a minute ago. I've seen him a couple of times today." Tom shook his head. "Haven't seen anyone like that. Maybe he's just passing through." But there was something in his tone, distracted, almost uneasy, that made her think he had noticed something too. He gave Max's leash a gentle tug and turned toward the backyard without another word. Sarah stood there for a moment, watching him go. It wasn't like Tom to brush off a question like that. The rest of the afternoon passed in fits and starts. She'd sit down to read, then hear a faint noise outside and get up to look. She'd try to make a grocery list, only to abandon it halfway through when her mind wandered back to that car. By 4 p.m., her nerves were frayed. The final straw came when she stepped out to take the trash to the curb. She had just set the bin down when she caught sight of the sedan again, this time creeping slowly past her house. It didn't stop, but the tinted windows gave her the unsettling feeling that whoever was inside was looking right at her. She stood frozen for a moment, the sound of the engine fading down the street. Then she went back inside, locked the door again, and pulled the curtains closed. Sarah told herself it was probably nothing. She lived in a safe neighborhood, after all. But as evening settled in, the unease that had been with her all day only grew stronger. She couldn't help feeling that someone, was closing in. The house felt unusually still as evening shadows began to stretch across the street. Sarah sat curled up on the couch, the curtains drawn, a half-empty mug of tea cooling on the coffee table in front of her. She had turned the TV on for background noise again, but she wasn't paying attention. Her mind kept replaying the day's events. The unfamiliar car, the man in the hoodie, Mrs. Carter's unease, and Tom's strange avoidance of the topic. It was while she was staring absently at the muted television that she heard for the first time a faint, distant wail. At first, she didn't register it as anything unusual. Sirens were common enough. The main road was less than a mile away, and emergency vehicles often passed through on their way somewhere else. But something about this sound was different. It was faint at first, a thin ribbon of noise winding its way through the quiet of the neighborhood, but it didn't fade the way it normally did. Instead, it grew steadily louder. Sarah sat up a little straighter, straining to listen. The sound was still far away, but the pitch and volume told her the vehicle or vehicles were coming closer. She stood and crossed the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to peek outside. The street looked empty. The sedan was nowhere in sight, and the late afternoon light cast everything in a soft, golden glow that made the scene almost peaceful. But the sirens didn't match the picture in front of her. They grew louder still, and now she could make out more than one. The distinct difference in tone between them suggested at least 2, maybe 3 vehicles. The high, urgent wail cut sharply through the air, bouncing off the houses and making it hard to tell exactly where they were coming from. She told herself it could be an accident nearby, maybe a fire truck, maybe an ambulance. But then came the deeper, throaty roar of engines, fast-moving engines accelerating hard. That wasn't the sound of vehicles just passing through. That was pursuit. A low hum of unease settled into her chest. Sarah moved to the front door and opened it just enough to step out onto the porch. The air outside was cooler now, carrying the faint scent of someone's dinner cooking down the block. She scanned the street again, her eyes narrowing as she tried to pinpoint the direction of sound. It was louder now, much louder, and it was moving fast. Somewhere behind her, a door slammed, and she turned to see Mrs. Carter standing in her driveway, her arms folded tightly across her chest. Their eyes met for a brief second, and Sarah could see the same question mirrored there. What's going on? Before she could say anything, the first flash of light appeared at the far end of the street, a streak of red and blue cutting through the fading daylight. Then another, and another. The sirens, now deafening, seemed to vibrate in her chest. Sarah's heart began to pound. 3 police cars, maybe more, were barreling toward them. The flashing lights reflected off windows and car hoods, splashing the neighborhood in frantic bursts of color. Instinctively, she took a step back toward her door. She had never seen this kind of urgency in her neighborhood before. Police had shown up for the occasional domestic dispute or traffic accident, but never like this, never with this speed and force. The vehicles closed the distance quickly, and she realized they weren't slowing down. In fact, they were accelerating as they approached. She glanced toward Mrs. Carter, who had now retreated halfway up her driveway, her eyes wide. Sarah's mind raced through possibilities. Were they chasing someone? Had there been a robbery nearby? Was there some kind of emergency she didn't know about? The police cars roared past the first row of houses, their sirens a wall of sound now, until the lead car suddenly jerked aside and stopped hard, right in front of Sarah's house. The others followed, tires squealing, the smell of hot rubber and exhaust filling the air. Sarah froze. Officers poured out of vehicles in a coordinated rush, some moving to form perimeter, others speaking urgently into their radios. One of them glanced toward her porch, his eyes locking with hers for a split second before he pointed in her direction and barked something she couldn't quite hear over the noise. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She took another step back, her hand gripping the doorframe. Mrs. Carter was now completely out of sight, probably back inside her house. The rest of the street seemed to hold its breath, blinds twitching as neighbors peeked out to see what was happening. The sirens began to die down as the engines were cut, but the tension in the air didn't ease. The flashing lights kept pulsing, casting the street in alternating bursts of red and blue. Sarah felt as though she had stepped into someone else's life, someone who belonged in the middle of whatever this was. Only she had no idea why it was happening here. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as the scene in front of her exploded into movement. The first police car had stopped so abruptly that its tires left faint black marks on the pavement. Doors slammed open in unison, and uniformed officers surged out, their radios crackling with clipped, urgent voices. "Move, move, move," one officer shouted, his voice sharp over the fading wail of the sirens. 2 officers immediately took positions at opposite ends of her driveway, their hands hovering close to their holstered weapons. Another pair ran toward the side of her house, disappearing from sight. The sudden flurry of motion made her head spin. Sarah stood frozen on her porch, one hand still gripping the doorframe. "What's going on?" she called out, her voice tight, almost swallowed by the noise around her. No one answered. An officer in a dark tactical vest strode directly toward her, one hand extended as if to keep her in place. "Ma'am, I need you to step back inside your house right now," he said firmly. Her instinct was to comply, but her confusion got the better of her. "Why? What's happening?" "Inside now." His tone left no room for negotiation. Sarah took a small step backward, retreating into the shadow of her doorway. Her mind was trying to keep up. Were they here because of the man in the hoodie? The sedan? Something else entirely? From the corner of her eye, she noticed more movement. Another police car had pulled up behind the first 3, and 2 plainclothes officers stepped out, one speaking quickly into a phone while the other scanned the street with a practiced, calculating gaze. The neighborhood had come alive. Curtains twitched in several houses, and across the street, Mr. Patel was standing just inside his screen door, his expression unreadable. The air buzzed with a strange, electric tension, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. Sarah's attention snapped back to the officers as one of them spoke urgently into his radio. Unit 4 in position. Suspect possibly on the property. Awaiting confirmation. Her stomach dropped. On the property? Before she could process the thought, another officer jogged up the walkway, his eyes locked on her. "Ma'am, is there anyone else inside your house?" Sarah's mouth went dry. "No, I live alone." He exchanged a quick glance with the officer in the tactical vest, then spoke into his shoulder mic, "House may be clear," requesting entry authorization. Her pulse was pounding so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. "Wait, entry? You want to come inside?" "Standard procedure," the officer replied, his tone clipped but not unkind. "We have reason to believe a suspect may have entered the premises. For your safety, we need to make sure." Sarah's mind reeled. She hadn't seen anyone enter her house, hadn't heard anything unusual beyond the sirens, but the look in the officer's eyes told her this wasn't a request. She stepped back fully into her living room, holding the door open as 3 officers moved past her in a coordinated sweep. The sound of boots on her hardwood floor was jarring the quiet space, punctuated by the occasional clear as they checked each room. From her spot near the doorway, Sarah could see one officer methodically opening closet doors, while another peered behind furniture. The third moved toward the back door, his hand resting lightly on his weapon. In less than 2 minutes, they were back in the front room. "House is clear," one of them reported. Sarah exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, but the tension outside hadn't eased. Through the window, she could see more officers positioning themselves along the perimeter of her property. One was speaking urgently into a handheld radio while scanning the street. The officer in the tactical vest stepped back toward her. "We believe the suspect may be in the immediate vicinity. We need you to remain inside until we've secured the area." Sarah nodded numbly. "Who is the suspect? What did they do?" He hesitated, glancing toward the door before answering. "I can't share details right now, ma'am, but I assure you this is for your safety." The lack of specifics made her stomach churn. She closed the door slowly, the muffled chaos outside now her only soundtrack. Through a narrow gap in the curtain, she watched as 2 officers moved toward the side alley that ran between her house and the Johnsons'. A third officer took up position near the rear fence, crouching low as he scanned the yard. From somewhere behind the houses came the faint sound of a dog barking, sharp, insistent, as if it too sensed something was off. Sarah backed away from the window, her mind racing. She couldn't shake the thought of the man in the hoodie. Had he been watching her house for a reason? Was the sedan somehow connected? A sudden shout from outside made her jump. "We've got movement." She rushed back to the window, heart hammering. The officers along the side alley had tensed, one raising his hand to signal to the others. Another voice barked an order she couldn't quite catch. For a few tense seconds, no one moved. Then, in a blur of motion, 3 officers disappeared around the corner of her house, their footsteps pounding against the pavement. Sarah's breath came in shallow bursts. She didn't know whether to be relieved they were chasing someone away from her home, or terrified that danger was literally steps from her door. And for the first time all day, she realized she no longer felt safe inside her own house. The pounding on the door was so forceful that Sarah felt in her chest. It wasn't a polite knock. It was urgent, demanding, almost threatening. "Sarah Mitchell." "Open the door immediately," a voice barked from the other side. Her legs felt heavy, her mind racing through every possible reason why the police would be at her house. She wasn't in trouble. At least, she didn't think she was. She had never even had a speeding ticket. She took a hesitant step toward the door, her bare feet cold against the wooden floor. "What is this about?" she called back, trying to keep her voice steady. The reply came instantly, sharp and unyielding. "Step outside now, ma'am. Hands where we can see them." That made her pulse quicken even more. They weren't here for a friendly chat. Her hands trembled as she reached for the doorknob. She cracked the door open just enough to peek out. But before she could say a word, the door swung wider under pressure of an officer's gloved hand. 2 uniformed men stood directly in front of her, their eyes scanning her face with intense focus. Behind them, more officers moved quickly across her lawn, some taking positions behind cars, others circling toward the side of her house. "Ma'am, we need you to step outside. Now," the first officer repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. Sarah's throat tightened. "Can someone please tell me what's going on?" she asked, her voice a mix of fear and irritation. The officer didn't answer her question. Instead, he made a subtle hand gesture to another officer, who stepped closer with what looked like a clipboard. The second officer spoke, his voice calmer but still firm. "We're here on urgent business. For your safety and ours, we need your cooperation. Step outside, keep your hands visible at all times, and follow our instructions." Sarah's mind screamed with questions. Urgent business? For her? What safety? But she could see in their faces that pushing for answers now would be useless. She stepped outside slowly, her robe tightening around her as a gust of wind passed through. The street was now a surreal scene, flashing red and blue lights bouncing off every surface, neighbors peeking from behind curtains, and a cluster of officers scanning every direction. She glanced toward Mrs. Dunlop's house across the street, where a shadow moved away from the window quickly. Once Sarah was on the front porch, the lead officer raised his voice so others could hear. "We have her outside." That statement sent another chill down her spine. Have her? As if she was some target in an operation. She tried again, her voice shaky. "Please, I don't understand. Why are you here?" The officer's jaw tightened, and after a beat, he said, "Ma'am, all questions will be answered soon. Right now, I need you to stand right there and not move." He turned away to speak into his radio, his words clipped and fast, too low for her to catch. Another officer stood in front of her now, his stance firm, his eyes locked on hers, not in hostility, but as if he were guarding her from something, or maybe guarding others from her. The thought unsettled her deeply. Sarah's heart pounded as she tried to piece together the fragments. Strange car, the pacing man, the neighbor acting off, and now this full police presence. But every time she opened her mouth to ask for clarity, she was met with the same short responses. "Please remain calm, or we'll explain soon." Minutes dragged like hours. The officers' movements were coordinated, almost rehearsed. One officer crouched near the curb, speaking into a headset. Another scanned the rooftops with binoculars. The lead officer occasionally glanced at Sarah, as if checking she was still in place. It was like she had been placed in the middle of a movie scene she didn't audition for. She swallowed hard, her voice dropping to a near whisper as she asked the nearest officer, "Am I in danger?" He hesitated, just for a second. But in that second, Sarah caught something in his eyes. Not fear, not suspicion. Something else entirely. And that's when she realized whatever was going on, it wasn't random. They weren't here by mistake.